There used to be a fairly well-known cemetery near my neighborhood. Back then, I often played tag on bicycles with my friends in a large park nearby. One day, our leader-like friend, A, suggested that just playing in the park was getting boring, so we decided to play tag near the cemetery that day. There were 5 of us, me, my younger brother, A, B, and C. We decided on the off-limits areas and played rock paper scissors to choose the it. B became the chaser. My brother, C, and I ran off in the same direction, but A went the opposite way. My brother usually followed me when running, but since it was an unfamiliar place and he was nervous, he told A, "Don't come this way," and ran in his direction. A little while later, B and I found C, and we decided to regroup. However, no matter how long we waited, my brother and A didn't return. We had set a meeting point, so I thought they were just running late, and we all eventually went our separate ways since we had extracurricular activities and other things to do. I think it was a Tuesday, which was the day I had calligraphy lessons. About an hour later, I came home, only to find my brother crying. I had no idea what had happened, but after he calmed down a little, I asked him, and he said that something was strange about A. When I asked for details, he told me that he was playing tag with A, but since my brother got in the way while running, A ran ahead on his own. My brother desperately tried to keep up, but he lost sight of A and started looking for him. The area was full of temples and narrow alleyways, making it a perfect place for a game of tag. While searching, my brother spotted B, the it, looking around, so he hid in one of the alleys. That's when he noticed A's bicycle deep inside a narrow alley. I often used the trick of leaving his bike behind and hiding somewhere else, so my brother figured he must be nearby and started heading in the opposite direction. And then, he found A. However, his posture was unnatural. He was standing still, completely motionless, as if time had stopped around him. No matter how many times my brother called out to him, A didn't respond or even flinch. My brother shook him, but there was no reaction. He stayed there for about 10 minutes, but as time passed, my brother became more and more frightened and ran away. Trying to go home, he ended up getting lost, which was why he arrived so late. Thinking this was too strange to ignore, my mother, my brother, and I went to the place he had described. Since my brother's memory was vague, it took us over an hour to get there after leaving the house. I don't remember much clearly, but I recall the place feeling eerily dim, probably because it was evening. Maybe it was also because there was a shrine nearby. As a child, I was extremely scared, and I remember gripping my mother's clothes tightly as I entered the area with my brother. As we walked down the path, we eventually came across A's bicycle at the entrance of a small alley. And on the opposite, deserted side of the path, we found A. But A's posture was clearly abnormal. It looked like he had tried to hide. He was standing in the shadows of the alley, but he was completely frozen, like a wax figure. It was as if the clock around him had stopped, and only he was trapped in time. He was slightly hunched forward, with one foot awkwardly raised while balancing on the other. It was an unnatural position for any human to hold. To put it simply, it was like one of those special effects scenes from The Matrix. There was no way a human could maintain that posture. It was obviously an unnatural sight. We had been standing there, watching him for nearly 10 minutes. A was clearly not joking around. Besides, it wasn't a position someone could hold on purpose. If what my brother said was true, A had been frozen in that position for about 4 hours. Then, suddenly, my mother grabbed A's arm and yanked him. At that moment, A lurched forward with a loud "gah" sound and started moving again. He looked completely bewildered and asked, "Why is everyone here?" He seemed a little tired, but he had no memory of what had happened. His expression looked as if he had simply felt a little dizzy. Oh, and now that I think about it, A's mother had joined us at some point too. I think my mother must have called A's house. I don't remember the details. I just remembered one more thing. A was standing in the middle of the road, where a tree was growing. Even now, I still find it strange. According to A, he had been playing tag with his friends. While trying to escape from his younger brother and find a hiding spot, his mother suddenly grabbed his hand. When he finally came to his senses, he realized something strange. I was about to hide, but somehow, the game was already over, and it was nighttime. No matter how he thought about it, it didn't make sense. He told this story a few more times over the years, but his memory of that moment remained blank. All he could say was, "I suddenly realized it was nighttime." Now, let's go back about a year. A had been in a band with B and 2 other friends. One day, one of A's friends was performing at a live music event. Since I was interested, I went to see the show and joined them for the after party. I had planned to catch the last train home, but B got completely drunk. We decided to leave him at a mutual friend's house nearby. D, who had nothing better to do, also stayed over to keep an eye on B. After dropping them off, I ended up missing my train and had nothing else to do. So, D and I decided to walk home, about 6 stations away. We had been walking for about an hour when the conversation turned to that strange event. I still found it unsettling and said, "I don't think I froze up, but I have no memory of that moment at all." Since we were already out late, we figured we might as well check out the location and investigate. By this time, it was around 3 a.m. The area was filled with cemeteries and shrines, giving it an eerie atmosphere. Relying on our memories, we started searching for the spot. I was feeling uneasy, while A, though just as scared, was trying to act tough. We must have searched for about an hour. Just as the sky started to lighten, A suddenly said, "I remember this place." It wasn't a location I recognized, but I followed A's lead. We continued walking and found a narrow, dark staircase leading downward. At the bottom, a thin pathway stretched out in front of us. I had no recollection of ever taking such stairs, but it seemed we had approached from the opposite direction of my original visit. Eventually, we emerged onto a road I did recognize. As I glanced around, I noticed something strange. A looked shocked and was gripping his own arm tightly. Then, without warning, he grabbed my hand and started running. I didn't question it, I just ran with him. At some point, I realized the sun had risen. Checking my watch, I saw that it was already close to noon. I was utterly confused, and a cold sweat began to form on my skin. I kept pulling me along the path we had taken. My memory was hazy, but as we ran, a terrifying realization hit me. Just like A that day, maybe we had also been frozen in place. A and I ran until we were completely out of breath. My mind was spinning with confusion, but I remember calling out to A, asking, "What's wrong?" By the time I realized where we had ended up in a narrow path near a graveyard, one that seemed both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. This area was known for having a lot of cemeteries. It was vast, with residential houses scattered around. High walls surrounded many of the areas, likely for security reasons, making it easy to get lost once you wandered in. Panting and drenched in sweat, A and I stood there trying to catch our breath. It was the middle of summer, and sweat dripped from our bodies. Suddenly, A bent over and vomited into the corner of the pathway. For a moment, I feared he had seen something horrifying. But it turned out he was simply suffering from exhaustion and dehydration, possibly mild heat stroke. We decided to head to a nearby convenience store, bought some water, and took a break for about an hour. A sat there with his head down, looking visibly disturbed. Unlike before, he barely spoke. Even when I tried to lighten the mood with comments like, "That was weird, huh?" or "Are you okay?" all he responded with was a quiet, "Yeah." At the time, I thought he was just feeling unwell from dehydration, so I didn't press the issue. But what really bothered me was what had just happened. Had we experienced the same phenomenon A had years ago? The whole situation felt strangely surreal. After A had somewhat recovered, we agreed to call it a day and head home without any real answers. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, so I called A. No answer. I tried several more times, but he never picked up. Normally, he was quick to reply to messages, but that day, I didn't get a response at all. The following day, I called him again, but still no answer. I was growing increasingly uneasy. After work, I decided to drop by A's house. When I rang the doorbell, his younger sister answered. I asked about A, and she told me that he had been acting strange ever since that night. He was listless, barely speaking, and wasn't eating much. My gut told me something was seriously wrong. I asked if I could see him, and she let me in. Wanting to snap him out of it, I decided to surprise him. Half jokingly, I yanked open his door with exaggerated enthusiasm, even pulling a dumb prank by flashing my backside a little as I burst into the room. But the moment I entered, my playful mood vanished. The only thing on in the room was a radio. I sat there, lifeless, as if all the energy had been drained from him. He barely reacted to my entrance, though he acknowledged me with a weak glance. This was not the A I knew. Worried, I gently asked him about his health, his lack of replies, and whether something had happened. I admitted that he wasn't feeling well but insisted it wasn't anything serious. He just hadn't been in the mood to talk to anyone. Then, I finally brought up what had been on my mind since that night. What exactly happened back there? I didn't respond at first. After a long pause, he quietly said, "Nothing happened." I hesitated. It didn't seem like the truth, but I also didn't want to push too hard. Yet, my curiosity and concern got the best of me, and I asked again. Each time, he avoided giving an answer. Finally, after I pressed him a little too much, I let out a long sigh and whispered, "Please don't ask me about it anymore." Hearing those words sent a shiver down my spine. Up until that moment, I had treated this as just a bizarre, fascinating experience. But seeing it like this, seeing how deeply it had affected him, made me realize that whatever had happened was far beyond mere curiosity. It was terrifying. Even as I worried about A, I couldn't shake off the fear, yet my curiosity wouldn't let it go either. I wanted to summarize the recent events, but there wasn't much of a resolution. Even now, thinking about it late at night still gives me chills. I wanted to check on A, but I couldn't bring myself to ask him anything. Before I knew it, I had lost contact with him. About 2 weeks later, just as I had begun to push the whole ordeal to the back of my mind, I happened to run into one of A's band members while I was out with friends. We had talked a few times at live shows and had shared drinks at after parties, but that was about the extent of our relationship. Since I was exhausted from shopping, I ended up joining him and his friend at a McDonald's near the station. We had some casual conversation, but eventually, the topic shifted to the band. That's when I learned that A had been completely unreachable for a while. The band member assumed I already knew and hesitated to bring it up out of concern. That's when I realized A had gone missing about 4 days after I last saw him. A sudden wave of fear hit me. My body trembled, and a strange, sticky sweat formed on my skin. I couldn't bring myself to tell the band member about what had happened, so we simply exchanged contact information and parted ways. Something inside me told me I needed to confirm the situation myself. Unable to sit still, I went straight to A's apartment that night. When I arrived, I saw that the lights in the house were on, but A's room was completely dark. At that moment, my fear turned into a suffocating sense of dread. This was beyond fear, it felt like something truly horrible had happened. I knew I had to inform A's family, but I had no idea how to explain it. His mother had passed away 5 years ago, and his younger brother, no matter how much I asked, claimed he had no memories of that time. Even if I wanted to speak to A's mother, she hadn't been there when it happened. A himself had never really spoken about being frozen in place. And now that he was missing, bringing it up felt impossible. I thought about going back to investigate, but he had already suffered after returning a second time. I couldn't bring myself to go back there alone. I wanted to tell my friends, but I was too shaken to say anything. In the end, I kept calling and messaging A every day. There was never a reply, but my messages still went through. For over a month, I tried calling him at different times of the day, but there was never an answer. As time passed, I started to feel like it was pointless. Still, I couldn't shake my sense of responsibility, so I sent occasional messages, hoping he would respond. 6 months passed. I spoke with A's mother and sister a few times, but I could never bring myself to tell them the full story. They never suspected that I had any connection to A's disappearance. I held onto my old phone number, feeling responsible for keeping the line open. Then, 6 months after A vanished, I suddenly received a call from him. I noticed it too late, the call had come in about 2 hours earlier. Because my old phone number attracted spam calls and one-ring scams, I had ignored most of my missed calls. I immediately called A back, but he didn't pick up. For the next 2 days, I called him repeatedly. On the second day, I finally answered. The first thing he said was, "I'm sorry for not picking up until now. I've been staying with some distant relatives." Then he added, "I'm really sorry about that time. Something terrifying happened." To understand A's story, we need to go back to his childhood. He had been playing hide and seek with his younger brother. Just as he was about to hide, he suddenly found himself standing still in the dark, his mother holding his hand. He had no memory of what happened in between. After returning home, I began experiencing strange dreams. In them, he would enter a cave. At first, he could see his surroundings, but as he moved deeper, everything became pitch black. Eventually, he would reach a dead end, a solid wall blocking his path. Then, a gust of wind would rise from below. Looking down, he would see a small hole in the ground, and within it, faintly glowing mushrooms. When he peered into the hole, the cave would vanish. Instead, He would find himself surrounded by shadows shimmering like glitter, dancing gracefully like ballerinas. And now, the story shifts back to 6 months prior. On the way home from a live concert, A and I visited that place again. He barely remembered the exact location, but the moment we arrived, time stopped, just like before. However, this time, something was different. Dark shadows, just like the ones in his dreams, twirled around him, scattering glitter like specks as they spun. Unlike the first time, when he hadn't even realized he was frozen, this time, he was fully aware of it. A was terrified. At first, he couldn't move at all, but as his fear grew, so did his desperation. He tried to move frantically, but his body remained completely paralyzed. He doesn't remember every detail, but he knew he was in deep trouble and fought with everything he had. Suddenly, the surroundings brightened. His body was free. Overwhelmed by panic, I grabbed my hand and ran. Lost among the graves, exhausted and terrified, I eventually collapsed and vomited. Everything that happened after that played out as I had already described earlier. For a week, fear consumed him. He couldn't eat and could barely function. He knew he had to leave this place. That's when he decided to stay with his relatives. This was typical of A, he always took action. For a few days, he didn't inform his family, but his relatives eventually contacted them. When he found out his family had been informed, he told them that he had left due to a personal issue related to a failed relationship and asked them not to share the details with anyone else. For the longest time, I never considered any connection between the shimmering shadows in his dreams and his real-life experience of time stopping. The thought never even crossed his mind. When I reached out to him, he was too scared to respond. But once he calmed down, he began to worry about me, too. And when I stopped contacting him as frequently, he finally decided to call. Now, here's why I wrote this on that thread. The thread was titled something like "Tell Me About Unexplained Incidents." The truth is, I had the same dream recently. That's why I was able to describe it in such detail. I remember it clearly, or maybe, I saw exactly what A saw. I'm sorry, but there's no ending to this story. Or rather, it's still ongoing. I want to investigate this again. But with everything that happened to A, should I really go back? For now, this is where the story ends. The last time I spoke with A was only once after that. And just to clarify the timeline, my phone call with A happened 1.5 years ago. The first time I experienced time stopping was 2 years ago. When I said 6 months ago, I meant 6 months after that first incident, not 6 months from now.